Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. Today is a special poll release version of the podcast. I mean, it's special in the sense that we don't do it every week, but we do it now roughly every other month. But still, special.
Feels like every week.
So on March 2nd, we released a new statewide poll of Texas attitudes, mostly, though not entirely, pegged to the legislative session that's now underway in Austin. I'm very happy to be joined today by my co-conspirators in the poll. Daron Shaw I was going to say Daron Shaw on my left, just to give a sort of little visualization and a subtle play, or not so subtle. But Daron Shaw, my friend and colleague, is University Distinguished Teaching Professor and Frank C. Irwin Chair of State Politics in the Department of Government here at UT Austin. I hear they're going to rename the Irwin Chair the Moody Chair. Just kidding.
No, I was going to say the longer the title, the less the expertise. So,
So thanks for being here, Daron. Appreciate it.
no, my pleasure, Jim.
And on my right, Josh Blank, the Research Director for the Texas Politics Project.
Here I am. I have no names other than that.
Here I am.
Well, I'll take a chair.
You need a Moody name.
A Moody.
I mean, everything's a Moody
There's
name.
Moody. Well, there's McCombs.
We'll come up with after we
peace,
go to a
right?
show at the
Go that
Moody.
way.
Yeah, exactly.
So as I said, the poll was focused largely on the legislative session, and as a result, we approached it mindful of where we are, well, really where we were in the session at the time we were collecting data. That is, we collected in mid to late February, and things were sort of still getting started. And while there's a lot of coverage of this bill and that bill, what we were really after was trying to get at the underlying attitudes for a group of people, that is the general public. They're not following the session very closely, which we saw in the data this time and have seen in the past. So, we're trying to get at the salience of policy areas, underlying attitudes, while in some ways keeping our powder dry for the most part on specific proposals till later in the session as we begin to get a better sense of the lay of the land. And there's some exceptions to that. There are things we know are going on. We asked some significant questions, some more specific questions in some ways about public education, a little bit about some of the business stuff. But by and large, we were looking at underlying attitudes. So, Josh, could you start by just giving us the nuts and bolts and field dates, et cetera, so people know what when and what we're talking about here?
Right, sure. So this is a survey of 1,200 self-identified registered voters in Texas. We were in the field from February 10th to the 21st. And so, that produces a margin of error for the full sample of plus or minus 2.83%, larger margins of error, for subgroups. And that's sort of the nuts and bolts. I mean, that's the basic. Yeah. I mean, I guess I'll just add a little bit to what you said, which is, if you've been listening to this podcast, which I think you would be if you're listening to this one, the last couple of weeks has been this really very much a discussion about what's going on inside the process. And we've been doing this for long enough, and some of us longer than others, right, to know that, we're sitting here having this very in-depth conversation about, early committee hearings that are going on. But we also know, studying public opinion, this is not where people are, normal people who don't follow this stuff closely or even work in the process, right?
Yeah, and so that points out a good place where we should start, which is let's look at what people are paying attention to. We started kind of the substantive or the issue part of the survey with questions about what people have heard about in the news. So walk us through a little bit of that, Josh, and then Daron, I'd like you to kind of respond to how you read this.
Yeah, I don't, so basically say, we were kind of interested first and foremost, and this is something we do, and it's it's almost more for other people than for us. It's a little bit for us, but one of the things is we have these stories that are going on that are huge. I think again within this community, it's like, oh, committee assignments are going on, right? They're talking about the budget. They're electing a speaker, and there's an idea inside the process like, oh, this is like a really big deal. People are fighting about whether they can spend their campaign money on the speaker's race. And it's just like, when we ask Texans, like just at the broadest level, like, are you paying attention to the session, right now? How close are you following it? We find fewer than 1 in 10 of any group of Texans says they're following the legislature extremely closely at this point. Now, we know from past sessions, it'll go up over time, right? But starting right now, ultimately, people aren't really, combing through bills, right? At the same time, the Texas news is competing with a lot of other stories, right? There's, inflation, there's the war in Ukraine, there's the handling of classified documents by both the former president and the current president, right? There's a debt limit. So one of the things we want to do early on in the poll was just to get a sense of like, what is the relative levels of attention that Texans are paying to these issues? And then are there any sort of interesting differences between them, right? Is that a good sort of step?
Yeah,
So that we can, and this is, like, I'll just say this. It would be easy to say like, oh, you do this. And then you say like, well, then why did you ask him all this other stuff? It's like, no, we did this because it actually contextualizes why we ask people other stuff in the way that we ask them, which is we're not asking about specific policy proposals they've never heard of, they haven't thought about. It might not even make it out of a committee. Right. We're asking them about their general ideas about the directions of state government, levels of spending, and in some of the big areas, some deeper questions where we know there's going to be action.
So, Daron, this is like, in some ways, this is obvious, maybe. It's obvious in a lot of ways in terms of what we know about the salience of national issues versus local stuff. But there were a couple of interesting items in here, and what did you make of what we got here?
Well, first, I'd like to strongly object to the notion that your audience hasn't expanded greatly by my presence here at this particular pod. So,
that's right.
I hope that is duly noted. So, if the listeners take a look at
right
this,
now Shelley's nodding.
Yeah. My wife and children, I think, have probably
not all of them,
probably tripled the audience. Yeah, Well, you get a 50% hit rate amongst your family, and you're doing pretty well. So, the way we've sort of situated this, we actually asked people, have you heard about these? We didn't say in the national news, but we asked several questions that are essentially national questions, and then we asked some state questions. And one of the things that I find interesting, and sort of a kind of a nerdy perspective, but I think it's illustrative of bigger points, is that you're talking about the national issues, and you're getting close to 2/3 of people said they've heard something, or a lot, I should say, about increased prices or inflation. You get well over 50% saying they've been paying attention to the war in Ukraine. The document, controversies are about 50%.
Bubbles right about 50. Yeah.
Then you get to the state stuff, and even the top issue, which is abortion, scores a little over 1 in 3, right? So you're really talking about, from the top national issue to the top state issue, at least in terms of people saying they're paying attention, it's about a 30 percentage point drop.
Yeah.
And frankly, this is in the interest, since we're all responsible for this poll being slightly self-critical, we're asked about, how much have you heard in the news? And I'm a little dubious about some of these, the exact magnitude of some of these numbers. I think what the audience should do is probably read these numbers as an indication of how much attention people are paying, or how salient, as you mentioned, Jim, they think the issue is. Right, as opposed to the particular numbers, like, do I really believe that 1 in 10 Texas registered voters are really paying a lot of attention to committee assignments in the state legislature? No,
right.
I think people are trying to respond to the pollster. They're polite. So I'd say people pay a little less attention to the specific numbers, pay attention to the relative numbers within the battery of state questions, and then the comparison between some of the national issues and state issues. I think that gives you some insight into the psyche of the American voter right now.
And I'll add into that some comparisons between different groups, right? So for example, in terms of we think about attention to the number of migrants crossing the U.S.-Mexico border, unsurprisingly, a lot more, Republicans were much more likely to have heard a lot about this than Democrats. And you can see the relative weight that different groups are necessarily sort of placing on different issues in terms of, because again, this goes two ways, right? Part of this, an idea is this is not a measure of what's in the news. This is a measure of what people have a sense of what's going on out there and what they think they're hearing about. And you can see, given the sort of bifurcation of media habits and all that kind of stuff, that different groups of people are hearing about different things at different rates. And that's sort of what's interesting.
In some sense, it's, you almost want to read this as a question of if I put all of these things in front of you, which one would you read first, or which one would you care most about?
Yeah. And when we analyze, when I analyze, the first thing I do is I said, let me sort this by the share of people who've seen a lot, because that's actually what's interesting. It's seeing what the rank order is, and I think that's exactly the point you're making.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, the main point of this, I think, as we take away right now is the real gap between what's taking up sort of headspace for people is mostly national.
Yeah.
Right. And even, if you look at Daron mentioned how the top issue in Texas was 36% saying that they paid attention to changes in abortion laws in Texas.
A lot of attention, yeah.
That might be one of the most national stories in the state.
Right, and that's being driven by Democrats.
Right. And that's exactly. So,
right.
So I would urge people to kind of look at that. So, okay, so, we also talked a bit, we've already talked a bit about attention to the legislature. Now, in keeping with the theme of kind of where we were at and how we time this, we gave people something that we tend to try not to do, although, we do it periodically, which is we provided an open-ended question that tried to focus people a little bit more on the legislature and ask people what they thought in a few words the legislature should prioritize while they're in session. And it really does underline the degree to which it's a pretty diffuse kind of topic.
Yeah, I mean, so real quick, I mean, the top issue named by people was immigration, some immigration or border security related issue, and that was 1 in 4 voters. 24% said this should be the legislature's top priority. And then after that, no other area got more than 10%, right? And that may sort of sound, I mean, in some ways that could sound kind of like, well, what, again, it's like, well, what's the point of that? It's like, well, actually, how diffuse that is the point. Right? It's that, it's not as though at this point in the session, the public is calling for something specific. It's not as though we're saying, say certain publics are calling for some specific things, but overall, like you don't look at this and say, this is going to be an education session or this session has to be about property taxes. Otherwise, they're not meeting what the voters are asking for. And in fact, property tax is something certainly going to be taken on. And 4% of voters said something about property taxes. If we had the 2% who said something about housing, we're at 6%, so we're at 1/4 of the people who said immigration and border security.
Yeah, and interestingly enough, this doesn't look that different than the MIP state.
No, this is pretty much. I mean, I would say this is kind of what you would expect when you don't give people any sort of constraints. And these are all these are the issues. It's not as though there was some crazy sort of hidden things that kind of came out of this, and you say, oh, I didn't realize that was an issue. I mean, the top issues are immigration.
It's going to be very disappointing to the marijuana.
Yes,
advocates.
It's not the top issue. But if you look down the overall list, immigration, border security is at the top, 24%. Then you have inflation and cost of living, 8%. Gun control or gun safety, 7%. The economy, 6%. Education, 5%. Energy or the grid, 4%. Healthcare, 4%. Property taxes, 4%. Abortion, 3%. And then it just kind of trails off. But those are, that's not a bad sweep.
You don't look at any of those and go, oh, nobody's been talking at all about any of this. So Daron, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I would probably combine inflation, cost of living with the economy. Yeah. So that's 8% and 6%. So that ends up, if you put those two numbers together, you end up with 14%, which trails only immigration and border security. So those are the two top issues. I mean, just a couple of small observations. The first is abortion is offered as an open-ended response by only 3%. That's not to suggest that it's not on people's minds, that it's not important, but it doesn't score off the charts. And this has been an interesting conversation both in Texas and nationally about the cutting power of abortion, about its resonance, particularly with Democratic voters. By the way, I don't mean to suggest that it is not a salient issue, because amongst Democrats, it scores quite a bit higher. Josh, I don't remember the particular
This is 5,
numbers.
but I have a question for you, actually. But I was wondering, you may have the answer to this or not, and if you don't, that's okay. I was just wondering, I wonder, because you look at more national polling and stuff, and I wonder, in states where you have Democrats in control of the legislative process, are Democrats expecting more on abortion than in a state like Texas, where in some ways the smart Democratic play would be no, don't touch that, that's fine, right? Yeah. Because you're not going to get what you want.
Right. Actually, what is interesting right now is it would be a reasonable hypothesis to say that in states like Texas, or states with restrictive abortion laws that have either been triggered by the Dobbs decision or have been passed subsequently, that abortion should be a rallying point for Democrats, ought to score very high with Democrats. Whereas in states like California or New York that already have permissive abortion laws on the books, that abortion shouldn't be as much of an issue because of the state context. That's actually not what we're finding right now. And there's an interesting conversation to be had about the nature of the abortion issue right now.
Yeah.
I kind of think it's a marker issue for women's rights more generally, particularly for people of a certain generation.
I'm going to tell you right now, in coding these open-ended responses, that was what was crossing my mind a little bit in terms of trying to figure out, looking at the comments, where exactly some of these things went. And it would be interesting to go back, actually look at the O'Bannons. And I mean, again, it's a small sample within the whole thing, but just to see some of the demographics there and see how the language might be different.
Right. I think, there's two obvious, and this is an oversimplification probably, but my working hypothesis would be that, for women who came of age during Roe, abortion is such an important, issue with respect to their rights, with respect to understanding the party's positions, with respect to women's rights. So that's kind of one group of people for whom this is a big issue. The other potential group are people who are, have a self-interest or direct, kind of interest in the abortion issue now. And to be kind of totally practical, be women and I guess men too, but of a certain age.
Yeah, I've been using the term gestational age, and every time I say it, somebody bristles, so I try not to say it. Luckily, I'll only do it on podcasts because I can't say it.
It's a little labby.
Yeah,
I'm sorry. Hey, guys, let's shoe fits.
Yeah,
we're
our
lab
trying.
coat fits.
We're always trying.
Next week we'll have Don Lemon on the show.
Yeah, exactly. But my sense right now is that it's actually not showing up as a driving issue for young people, for instance, the way you might have expected. It does seem to be showing up for let's say men and women between 45 and 64 years of age, and so that's very kind of slender, but at least suggestive evidence about how this issue is playing. The other thing, just a small comment on the multiplicity of issues, right? That there's not a real focus. This was evident in the 2022 midterms. And I think people misread it a little bit. That is to say, the Democrats didn't have a single rallying. Dobbs and abortion got a lot of attention. But there were a lot of smaller issues for Democrats. And I think they ended up mounting to something kind of coherent and something that did succeed in mobilizing Democrats in a way that we hadn't quite expected. You also see that on the Republican side, too, where it's partially immigration and border security. It's partially crime. It's partially, sort of parental involvement in the schools. It's partially inflation. So on both sides, neither party has really rallied around a single issue. But I don't think that means that the issues aren't important or salient right now. I just think they're awfully diffuse.
Well, what I would say about that, though, is that among Republicans, half said immigration and border security.
Right. But nationally, that's
that doesn't mean they're always talking about that, but it's a pretty great fallback position if you're a Republican candidate.
I think that's right. But nationally, I think what you'll see in Texas is that it overwhelms everything, right? And we see that in these data. Nationally, issues like crime and inflation and gas prices come up too close to those levels such that if you're a Republican, it's not national Republican. It's not obvious what you should be talking, although certainly from some of the conversation early on with some of the Republican wannabes out there that immigration is a huge part of their rhetoric.
It's almost like a security blanket, right? I mean, I think their polling is telling them the same thing that our polling is telling us.
Right, and again, for the listeners, it's border security as opposed to immigration. There's not a big conversation about pathway to citizenship or punishing people here. It's all about securing the border and dealing with the southern border crisis to kind of mouth.
Yeah, and that's and that's an innovation. We've talked about it. I mean, that's sort of innovation that slowly evolved in Texas, I think.
Yeah,
right.
Josh, you were going to say something? I thought you had.
Well, I was just, it was reacting to what you were saying about sort of the lack of a single sort of campaign theme. And it is interesting because I've studied campaigns and elections with you, and there is sort of like over time in history, you can sort of say like, oh, that campaign was about X or that campaign was about Y, and it is really interesting thinking even over the last, let's say, I would even 16-ish years, let's say, maybe 14-ish years, let's say, right? I'm trying to think like 2008, 2012. Well, it's a range, But you start thinking about the fact that the idea of like, not only like at the same time that, sort of Obama and his, coalition of the ascendant and trying to bring people together under like a specific, under kind of a general banner here that brings together these democratic issues, which are, again, kind of disparate and all that kind of stuff. And you have to bring all these people together. But I was also thinking about the changes in the media environment too, in the sense that there isn't a national narrative anymore, really, that like people would say, oh, this is what's going on,
Yeah.
And I wonder how much that plays into this idea that even reinforces in the parties, this sort of like fragmentation, both between them and among them, because, even in the Republican Party, it's like, Fox News is a segment of that electorate. There are more conservative options out there, much more conservative options. There are less conservative options. But like, I mean, to your point, there is a little bit more, almost, it's sort of strange to say, but like, there's a little bit more heterogeneity maybe in Republicans.
I think
used to be.
Jim and I, Josh is probably too young to remember this, but we remember the 92 campaign and it's the economy, stupid. It was all about the economy. And I think a lot of us who kind of came of age during that time felt that going into 2022 that the inflation and rising prices were going to just absolutely kind of dominate the conversation. And I don't think that happened. And there are a lot of kind of explanations for why. But even within the broad topic of inflation, there is, to use your phrase, heterogeneity. That is, well, rising prices meaning what? Meaning healthcare prices, meaning gas prices, meaning grocery prices. And what you saw, actually, we've done this in a couple of polls we've done. If you break it down and say, well, what part of rising prices are you feeling the most? Well, Democrats tend to talk about healthcare and prescription drug prices, and Republicans tend to talk about gas prices and groceries. So it begs the question, are we so polarized, are partisan views so different that it's possible to have an election that kind of centers around a single thing? Setting aside Donald Trump being that single thing, which I do think was...
Yeah, there are things that lend themselves to broader appeal. But as you guys were having that conversation, I was thinking, the difference between 92 and now, the biggest difference, there's a lot of them, obviously, but, media environment is one of them, but media environment is part and parcel of polarization and the sorting of the parties, right? So I want to go from the high level to something pretty specific. One of the interesting things to me about what we saw in these salience issues is, the kind of, the dog that didn't bark on property taxes. Because on one hand, reducing property taxes was a central component of most every Republican campaign in the state. From the legislature on up to the governor. It is one of the items that is preoccupying the discussion in the legislature, and yet, in that open-ended response, very few people mention property taxes, right? Single digits, 4% of voters, 7% of Republicans. Right. So it's not even that there's some partisanship hiding in these low top-level numbers. Right. Now, we did probe it a bit. We asked people how state taxes impact their personal finances. And when we asked that, a majority said, 58% said that property taxes have a major impact. And then when we kind of made people, force people into choice to say what has the greatest impact on your personal finances, 47% came back with property taxes. So, in some senses, it's kind of a validation of the approach in that if you talk to the public about it, they're going to say, or even if you give them some substantial property tax reduction, and we've polled on that in the past, it's got to be substantial. People will take it and probably take it happily based on their perception of tax burdens, but it's not driving a lot of attitudes, doesn't seem to me.
Yeah, but, part of it I think might be, and I'm just sort of, thinking about it as I look at this, it's also kind of what's available. There's a lot of aspects on this point I don't think we can necessarily get to in this podcast, where you say like, okay, there's Republican majorities, there's Republican leadership. Their main focus is going to be the will and desire of Republican voters. The lieutenant governor has said that directly, right? Yeah. And saying this is what the majority of the majority party wants in this state in talking about some of these policies. And when you look at property taxes, what's interesting is just the coalitional dynamics of the two parties really manifest themselves. And I'll just be real brief, simple brush here. The Republican Party tends to be older, tends to be whiter, more likely probably to own homes. Democratic Party tends to be younger, more likely probably to be renters who are not going to be affected by property taxes directly. And that comes out in the numbers because partisanship shouldn't necessarily affect your tax burden, but 68% of Republicans say property taxes have a major impact on their finances. 51% of Democrats, when we say what is the biggest impact, it's 59% of Republicans say property taxes, 40% of Democrats, 28% of Democrats say the sales tax, right? So if you're looking for, a nice sweet spot that hits 2/3 of your party, right, which is kind of where they were in the last session, there aren't a ton of spaces left, right? We could talk about this later, but they can't go much further on abortion restrictions. Can't go much further on gun restrictions without bumping up against, again, elements
some
within
boundaries.
their own party.
Some lane markers.
I'd put that Josh's point in a slightly different way at two levels. The first is, there is a leadership quality here, and that is that people are responsive to elite conversations. And it strikes me that property taxes are an issue where if you touch on it, if you play that chord,
resonates.
It's going to resonate, right? It's like, what is it? You throw a guitar down the stairs and it'll play the first 4 chords of Gloria. If you throw a Republican down the stairs, he'll play the first 4 chords of property tax reduction.
Right.
Yeah. And I think there's a reason for that. I think, that it does resonate with a particular group. But to Josh's point, here's how I'd put it slightly differently.
Yeah.
It's the same point, but, you're looking at issues that nobody's going to oppose, basically. Right. And if you talk about property taxes, Republicans are going to love it. Independents are going to really like it, and Democrats are fine with it.
They're not going to vote against it.
Exactly. And that's
Most
not
likely.
true of most of these issues. So in that sense, from a practical point of view, we're not talking about public policy, although I'm interested in this, Jim is, Josh is as well. But from a practical political point of view, it's kind of sitting there, as Josh suggested, just kind of smiling at Republican legislators that, this is, I'm right here, right? This is, we can go back and play the hits, and property tax reduction is one of those hits. It plays well with everybody. It alienates nobody. So you can see why it would be attractive, even if it's not showing up organically as one of the top 1 or 2 issues.
Right.
As we wind down a little bit, let's do our kind of round robin here. Let's start with you, Josh. Josh, what that we haven't talked about did you find interesting, small or large?
Okay, I'll go with something kind of small. In that salience battery of news items, we were asking, again, it was pretty long. I think it was about 14 different items. Some were national. Again, about half were state, maybe a little more. And one of the things we asked about was, how much they've heard in the news about ChatGPT. And, part of the reason that we put it in there is because, when we wrote this poll, ChatGPT was just everywhere in terms of the way that people were talking on the media, and they're talking about how this is going to be either the end or the beginning of all kinds of different industries, higher education, police and humanity. And, it's one of those things where I'm like, are people like even paying attention to this at all? And the answer is no. And I love that, because if you have any sort of thought about the future, what ChatGPT is going to do in the future, just so you know, only 14% of Texans said that they heard a lot about this in the period in which that was like all anybody was talking about. It wasn't the bottom of the list, but it was by far the lowest of our national story discussions. And I think it's just a reflection of the fact that, again, when you're talking about hard things, and especially kind of, in the media and at that kind of level, it's important to keep in mind that like people don't have developed views about like a lot of these technology related things. And a lot of times they're not even paying any attention to it. So 40% said they'd heard nothing.
Yeah, it's just the way Skynet wants it. Daron, how about you?
Can I go 2, even though I know we're in the rapid fire section of this? Within the abortion battery, what Josh and Jim and I have done together is kind of offered a different way of thinking about how to measure opinion on abortion. We know, people think of it as pro-choice, pro-life. Did you oppose Dobbs? Did you support the Dobbs decision? All of that's legitimate. Those sort of self-identification questions and reaction to the Supreme Court's decision are obviously important ways to measure opinion. But we have always been of the opinion that abortion opinion is much more subtle and nuanced, and it depends on 2 things. What are the conditions or the circumstances under which we're talking about a woman's right to choose? And secondly, what's the timing? And both these are relevant for public policy. So we've got a battery that I'd encourage everybody to take a look at, where we vary, okay, what's the circumstance? And it ranges from, a woman's health is in danger, that is, a woman's life is in danger, all the way to, the woman is married and does not want more children. So the sort of range of conditions. And then we ask, when would you permit an abortion? From never all the way to at any time during the pregnancy. And I'm always sort of interested in the variations. So just as for instance, when we ask the condition, when a woman's health is seriously endangered, only 7% say that you should never permit an abortion under those circumstances, right? Whereas if you say woman is married and does not want any more children, 34% say that you should not permit an abortion for that particular condition. And at the other end of the spectrum, woman's life is endangered. 43% say at any time during the pregnancy, an abortion should be permitted. Whereas if you say, if a woman's is married and does not want more children, only 16% say that she should have the right to terminate a pregnancy at any point, right? So you really get a thorough range of the variation of opinion. Second small thing, our friend Senator Ted Cruz, I'm interested in the percent strongly approving of Ted Cruz and the variance across years. There seems to be kind of an interesting dynamic here where the year heading into a re-election, the senator's numbers dip. And so for instance, last time he ran, we're talking about 2018, he ended up at that point with only, I'm looking at the February 2018 numbers, which are kind of analogous, getting close to where we are now. And he was at only 22% strongly approve. He's now at 21% strongly approve. And just, picking a random, in June 2021, he was at 31% strongly approved. February 2021, 33% strongly approved. So his internal support within the Republican Party seems to ebb and flow a little bit. And it's an interesting question of, were these numbers picked up by people in the Cruz campaign? Did it influence his decision to shut down speculation about a presidential run? Because I have a sense that if he had been ambivalent about that, that these numbers might have been stickier. That is, the Republican support and enthusiasm for Cruz may have been really tough to recover here.
Yeah.
Just a thought.
No, it's interesting. I mean, there's two things I think of about just in response to the Cruz thing. I mean, one, it strikes me that he has like surprisingly variable numbers just in general. I mean, I think,
for a guy with that much,
Yeah, I mean, people know who he is.
Right, exactly.
But I think part of it is that, there's almost no issue that Ted Cruz will not speak on. And that's not a criticism, but I mean, like, he has his podcast, like, he puts himself out there and really, like, and he ends up in interesting positions on things from time to time. And, he's not someone who's going to, like, walk that back. If you think about most politicians, if you say, would you like to have a really long public record on which people can look to see where you stand, or would you like to come out and just kind of be a blank slate? I would take a blank slate, if I want to win. And he's not a blank slate. And he's also constantly playing. The other thing that's interesting about the way you describe that is it compares so interestingly to Senator Cornyn, right?
Yes.
Who would love to have Cruz's numbers, but also, he has the opposite scenario, right? He comes into an election and then his numbers just start to tick up, and then the election ends and he goes back down.
Right.
And it's interesting, I mean, just to see those internal state dynamics with the senators, because they are so different.
Right. And the disapproved numbers are pretty, not entirely, but pretty consistent. It's the core of Democrats out there who do not like Cruz and do not like Cornyn.
That's not where the movement
That's
comes
not where the movement
from.
comes from, though. That's the thing. It's not.
You're right. Exactly.
It's all within Republican.
Are Republicans jazzed about their incumbent senator, or are they not jazzed about their incumbent senator? And you're right. It peaked in 2022. I think people's partisan juices get flowing. And now the election's over. Sessions in play. They're back in Congress. Republicans, at least control the House. And I think baggage accrues to the incumbent party a little bit, and you start offending people with actual policy positions, and
there's it's an endless source of precious metal to of ore to mine for precious metal. Comparing the two Texas senators, and I'm not familiar enough with the others. I mean, how could I be? I don't think, but with the dynamics in many other states, but the one here is really pretty fascinating.
It really is.
I mean, it's it's a study in contrast in so many different ways that it's hard to know.
Jim,
lean on it.
And Josh, it's interesting that it weirdly kind of encapsulates what I would suggest are somewhat perverse incentives in contemporary politics, because you've got Cornyn on the one hand, who seems to be focused on doing his job, holds key positions for the Republican Party and in the Senate. And you've got Cruz, who is very visible on social media and in the media generally. And it is, in fact, Cruz who is more popular amongst Republican partisans and is the focal point of attention and has, already run for president. And then poor John Cornyn's over there.
Just passing gun legislation and taking a hit in his numbers.
That's right. Just doing, his work, and doesn't seem to get much credit. And
I like the theme of perverse incentives in that a lot, actually. So, I'm torn by a couple of different things. So, Daron, you took two. I'm going to take two. So, one, and we can, since we're on the theme of, actually, I'm going to do this the other way. To go back to state stuff, I mean, there's a lot that we haven't talked about, and we'll be mining this in the podcast for the next couple of weeks.
Plug for the public education numbers. We have a lot in here on public education.
That's what
I was I was going to say.
Oh, I thought I was just playing.
Is that all right?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, we'll be feeding off this carcass.
Okay.
We'll be feeding off this carcass for a while.
So I'm looking at these public education numbers, and we'll be mining these a lot more going forward. But we gave people a range of, this is one of the areas where we're a little bit more specific. We gave them a large set of possible issues, asked them to rate the importance, and then rate the one they thought was most important for the legislature to address in the session. And the rankings were pretty interesting. Look, not surprising. There's a lot of spread here, as was inevitable probably given the number of issues. We gave people the complexity of the issue. Number one response was school safety, 29%. Second, teacher pay, 21%. Curriculum content, 17%. And then we went down into like under single figures, but the two competing at the top of the single digit results were parental rights at 9%, and then voucher educational savings percent accounts or other school choice legislation at 8%. Now, that's a very interesting kind of glimpse of the fight going on in public education, both at the policy level in the legislature, but also at the political level in things we've talked about in here before, and you kind of alluded to it in some indirect way, I think, Daron, in terms of the recoding of the public education issue among Republicans, raises this issue of issue ownership, et cetera. And this is another, issue where vouchers or, some kind of school choice legislation, very high on the lieutenant governor's and the governor's agenda, seemingly not nearly so high, to put it gently, on the House agenda, being promoted by the Speaker of the House, Dade Phelan. So these numbers are an interesting reflection of what's going on in that. So I would put that on the table. And then the other thing, frankly, is, as just, had to honestly explain to somebody why we did this, Josh and Daron, and I kind of didn't have much more to say other than, well, because it seemed kind of interesting. And that was, I gave a better answer than that, but at the end of the day, it's kind of, and that was the favorability rating for Ron DeSantis in Florida. Yeah. And DeSantis's, favorability ratings come up, on one hand, you can look at this glass half full, glass half empty. On one hand, he comes in below Greg Abbott, below Donald Trump in his favorability ratings in the state. But he is very well known in Texas. If you then flip that and look at the number of the share of people that don't have an opinion of him, it's about 22%. That's comparable to about where the lieutenant governor is. It's better than Senator Cornyn. And so, it's interesting that Governor DeSantis's kind of, political offensive that's going on right now. He'll be in Texas this Friday. He's got a book coming out that's getting a lot of attention. Mm-hmm. He's seen right now, at least, as the primary challenger to Donald Trump for the nomination. It's a pretty interesting item.
Yeah. Well, the public education stuff is interesting. We don't want to neglect that as we're sort of winding down here. But the DeSantis stuff is interesting. There was an interesting piece, I think, that Nate Cohn did. When I say piece, it's actually a figure from the piece that showed the current support in national polls for Trump, which is around 44%, and DeSantis, which is in the low 30s, that both of those numbers, each of those numbers, suggest the candidate's going to win the nomination. In other words, there are very few cases when you had a candidate polling over 30% at this stage of the contest, and that candidate did not go on to win the nomination. So, which is ironic because one of those candidates is not going to win the nomination, right. Possibly both. But I think it speaks to this, it's interesting. Not only did DeSantis command an enormous amount of attention in 2022 from amongst Republicans, but the Democratic media establishment went after him hard all year. So the fave-unfave numbers here largely reflect the fact that Democrats know who he is too.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And don't, and have decided, okay, he's a Republican and we don't like him very much. I think DeSantis' numbers look more like a Republican candidate, though, as opposed to Trump in Texas. In other words, I think Trump always had some ambivalence amongst Republicans in Texas. They ended up voting for him, but his numbers were, as we've commented several times, he underperformed an average Republican candidate in the state of Texas both times he ran. Mm-hmm. I don't necessarily see that for DeSantis so far. And there's an interesting primary dynamic right now, though, which is if you're one of the other Republican candidates, DeSantis is a much more tempting target. Despite the fact he doesn't have as much of the vote, it's unclear where his supporters would go if DeSantis were to falter. Trump's supporters would go to DeSantis. So if you're Mike Pompeo or Nikki Haley or Tim Scott or anybody, if you mess up DeSantis, it's possible to get his supporters. If you mess up Trump, first of all, you run the risk of getting trumped. But secondarily, you may only be helping DeSantis. So there's this interesting dynamic where the number two guy seems to be the one attracting most of the fire. And this might come under the heading of, is Donald Trump the luckiest candidate ever to run in the Republican primary context? But anyway, we're going to 16 months or however long to kind of watch this
Yeah, and we
unfold.
didn't, obviously we didn't test all of the Republican
Exactly,
candidates, which
exactly.
I had to explain. But I mean, DeSantis to my mind, is in a fairly singular position right now.
Yes.
I mean, I think the
in
point.
the political.
Yeah, and
universe.
I think the point to make, just from the public, means like this is unusual.
Yeah.
We've done, and we have to go back and look at some of our old stuff. But in terms of going into Republican primaries or Democratic primaries, where we have asked people attitudes about out-of-state politicians and even out-of-state governors and senators and other people, and it's not, in my recollection, it's very unusual to see someone, again, an out-of-state politician run with numbers that look like a former president or the current sitting governor.
Well, and the cycle looks so different. I was going back and sort of doing some thinking about this, and in our February 2015 poll, comparable point in the cycle, we were already polling the primary race because everybody and their brother and sister were in the Republican primary. I mean, we have one of those primary trial ballots in our February 2015 poll that's got
like 20 people in it.
The 12 or 15 candidates that were in there, just trying to figure out who knew who anybody was. And the only person, and again, it's not a good direct one-to-one comparison, but interestingly enough, the person that seemed to stick out other than the Texas candidates in that race, obviously Cruz and Perry were in it at that point,
right,
was Scott Walker.
Yeah. And Walker is the...
And Walker's the comparison people are trying to make. Somebody wrote a big piece
there was
about
a big
why
piece
it's
for
not
Walker
the right
is not
comparison.
DeSantis. The historic, and you go broke with historical analogies, but the ones that kind of come to mind most readily, one is a Republican one, that's Reagan Ford in 76, where you've got two, an incumbent president, but two dominant candidates. The one that actually might be better, though, is 2008, where you have Hillary Clinton. And then now DeSantis is at a position Barack Obama did not get to until the fall of 2007. But a front-running candidate with a lot of baggage, very controversial, being challenged by someone who is not the heir to the throne, but, seems to have emerged from amongst a variety of other candidates. The other candidates do not seem to have gotten the memo on this, and so they're still in the race. Right. We'll see how it plays out, but this winnowing of the field could be very interesting to watch. I'm not predicting DeSantis kind of survive. He could get, death by 1,000 cuts and could be brought down. On the other hand, you could have a two-candidate contest that emerges pretty quickly. And there's a nice line by Tom Bevan, I think, was asked about this and about who's getting in. And he said, I'm actually more interested in who gets out than who gets in. In other words, do Republicans who can't challenge Trump or DeSantis successfully fold their tents and go away, or do they stick in it? And the one difference between 2008 and 2024 is the incentives to go away aren't as great because the fundraising has changed so much.
Right.
Yep. But we got a lot of time to talk about this.
And perceptions of what's going on the Democratic side, I think.
Yes.
So.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think with that, we need to give up the studio. Darren, thanks for being here.
Always a pleasure, Jim. Josh.
Thanks for providing balance and your insight.
Fair and balanced. That's Josh Blank.
There you go.
Yep, always.
Hey, you got to write that down. Oh, wait.
I got on my mug over here.
Thanks very much to our staff in the audio studio, in the Liberal Arts Development Studio at the University of Texas at Austin. Again, the poll, which was just released, is available in multiple forms, broken down in lots of different ways at the Texas Politics Project website. That's texaspolitics.utexas.edu. Lots more analysis, thousands of graphics, summary documentation, data set, the whole shebang at our website. So please go to the website and look at this more. We'll be back breaking down a lot more of this next week. We'll follow up on the education point, drill more down into some of the legislative politics here on next week's Second Reading podcast. So thanks for listening, and we'll be back. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.